Well, good morning. So, if we zoom out from this passage and we just kind of picture what's been happening in Paul's life for the past 10 years, we see it's been very, very packed with action, right? For the past 10 years, he's been moving from city to city, doing evangelism. He's been planting churches. He's been strengthening congregations and training leaders. He's cast out demons. He's raised people from the dead. Like, if this is a movie, the church is starting. This is the dramatic music. Like, things are finally rolling, right? And then you blink, and now Paul is in prison. He's not traveling. He's not preaching in Athens to the greatest philosophers. He's not planting many churches. Everything just kind of cut, and the dramatic music has stopped. And so you might wonder, like, imagine you're a Philippian in the church in Philippi, and you're wondering how Paul is feeling. Maybe he's discouraged, or maybe he feels like he's failed in some way, or at the very least that this is a disruption to God's plan. Like, the church movement was getting started, and now it's interrupted. But this is not Paul's attitude. We see throughout the book that he is rejoicing. He is full of hope. Verse 20 says that he has earnest expectation and hope. And his expectation is that he's not going to be ashamed. He doesn't think that he's going to fail. He doesn't think that this is an embarrassment to Christianity. In fact, he has this attitude because he has the utmost confidence that Christ will be magnified. Right? In verse 20, he says, "My earnest expectation and hope that in nothing I shall be ashamed, but with all boldness, as always, so now also Christ will be magnified." He's confident that regardless of what happens, Jesus' character, his beauty, and his worthiness, his power will be made more evident to the world through this situation. But notice what happens here. Paul said he would not be ashamed, he would not be put down, he would not be discouraged, because Christ was going to be exalted, honored, and magnified. So we see that in Paul's mind, Paul's reputation is entirely tied to Christ's reputation. Right? Normally we would think, I'm not going to be ashamed because I know I'm going to be honored. Right? Like, if you were about to go play basketball and the other team's taunting you, you're like, I'm not embarrassed because we're going to beat them. Right? But that's not what Paul's saying. He's like, I'm not going to be ashamed because Jesus is not going to be ashamed. He's going to be magnified. So he's thinking, if Christ is magnified, I won't have failed. I won't be embarrassed. And Paul is living out his very own words that he's written in many other letters. Like in Galatians 2:20, he says, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. Or in Colossians 3:3, he says, for you died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. Or Galatians 6:14, he says, God forbid that I should boast except in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, by whom the world has been crucified to me, and I to the world. So we see that the idea of Paul being an independent man with his own kingdom to build is completely dead. He's fully invested in making much of Christ. So I'm not going to be ashamed because Christ is going to be magnified. But imagine you're, sitting in the Philippian church. Paul's in prison, in a Roman prison. And you might be thinking, Paul, how do you know Jesus is going to be magnified? Do you realize that you're in a Roman prison? Did you hear about John the Baptist? He was Jesus' cousin. He was also in a Roman prison. Do you hear what happened to him? He got his head cut off. Do you remember James, apostle? You might know his brother John. He also was in a Roman prison. You know what happened to him? His head got cut off. So Paul, how are you so sure that Christ is going to be exalted? You're in a Roman prison. Maybe you spend the rest of your life there, rotting away. Will that magnify Christ? What if your head gets put on a silver platter? Is that going to be magnifying to Christ? If so, how are you going to do that? With your head on a platter? And Paul's answer is, right, he says, Christ is going to be magnified, whether by life or death. And you ask how? His answer is in verse 21. He says, Christ will be magnified because for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. That's Paul's answer to that question. For me to live is Christ, to die is gain. This is a very well-known verse, maybe just under Joshua or John 3:16 and a few verses in Joshua, but it is very well known. Go to Tulsa to a mall, and I'm sure you're going to find a T-shirt with this verse on it or something like that. But when verses become well known, sometimes we forget to pause and ask if we actually know what the verse means. And I think it's especially important for this verse because it doesn't make even immediate grammatical sense, right? Even its lack of symmetry is a little surprising. We see to live is Christ, to die is gain. So we have live and die. That makes sense. Those are opposites. And then it goes to Christ and gain. What does it even mean to live is Christ? That's a person. Essentially, he's equating them, right? To live is Christ. Living is Christ. We already mentioned Galatians 2:20, where Paul says, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. So he's saying, I don't live anymore. Christ lives. When Jesus died, I died with him because I put to death that old person who's fascinated with sin and intent on building his own kingdom. That version of Paul is dead. Instead, Jesus lives. So, to live as a Christian is to participate in the life of Christ. We are ambassadors of Christ. That's what 2 Corinthians 5 says. We are appendages of his body. That's what 1 Corinthians 6 says. And Romans 12, right? If Jesus is the brain of a body, we are his arms and feet. So we're doing the will of the head. So a Christian life is supposed to be so closely fastened to the person of Jesus, so intertwined to him, that we can say, to live is Christ. When I think about being alive, I think about being Christ. Because those two ideas are so closely tied together. So Paul goes on. We still don't really understand what it means practically to live in a way where your life is closely intertwined with Christ. But Paul does go on the following verses and says, if I live on in the flesh, this will mean fruit from my labor. So for Paul, we see that living would mean fruitful labor. We can thus conclude that at the very least, to live is Christ must mean to labor fruitfully. It might mean more, but at the very least, to live is Christ means to live in a way where you labor fruitfully. So you can see Paul sitting in prison, thinking about the churches that he has started all across the known world. Galatia, Philippi, Colossae, Corinth, Thessalonica. the churches that he's partnered with that he didn't start, like in Jerusalem and Antioch. And he sees the fruit that could come if he was kept alive and was allowed to visit these churches again. He could strengthen them. He says in 25, he could contribute to their progress in the faith. He could contribute to their joy in the faith. He's thinking maybe, if these churches grow and multiply, they could have a wider effect into the pagan regions around them. Like Paul, being a visionary, is seeing what could happen if he stayed alive, the fruitful labor that could happen. We also know that Paul had a passion to preach the gospel where it had never been preached. And so he's probably also thinking about places like Spain that haven't been reached by the gospel yet. And he's thinking, if I stay alive and I'm released from prison, I could go plant churches there. And this would be a fruitful labor. And this was Paul's fruitful labor, to plant churches, to strengthen churches, to write letters to churches. Not because it's the only fruitful labor that exists, but because it's what Paul had been set apart to do. Right? He says throughout his letters that God set him apart to be a preacher to the Gentiles. It is Father's Day, so happy Father's Day. I have a father, like everyone in this room, I hope. And my father was not an apostle, also, like everyone in this room, I hope. If your father was an apostle, I'm very interested to meet him, talk to him. My father was a missionary, though, and he spent about 18 years in Nepal, and I have a lot of respect for the labor that he did there in Nepal. The work he led bore a lot of fruit. People came to know the Lord, and churches were planted, and Nepalis were trained to continue the work. We moved to the U.S. when I was 12, and it was here that I began to learn about other missionary families, or just families whose parents were in ministry, so maybe pastors' families as well. And I realized that a lot of these children, they had a disdain for the ministry, for working for Christ, or some of them simply refused to follow Jesus. And I began to wonder, why is this not the case for me and my 3 siblings? By the grace of God, my siblings are also following Jesus. And I was talking to my parents, and I began to realize, I think the reason is because the fruitful labor that my father was most committed to was not actually planting churches in Nepal. The fruitful labor that my father was most committed to was the labor of being a husband and the labor of being a father. He labored daily, teaching me and my siblings the Word of God. He disciplined us so that we might walk in righteous paths. Right? He worked to provide for my family, and I saw him love my mother well. And the faith I have today is, of course, from the Lord, but I think in many ways it is also the fruit of my father's labor. Not my father's labor to plant churches in Nepal, but my father's labor in the home to raise me and to walk in the ways of the Lord. Of course, it was the fruit of my mother's labor as well. It was my mother who first instructed me in memorizing Scripture. My mother labored over me in prayer and over my siblings too. But I think I was the favorite, so maybe more prayer for me. Of course, my parents were a team, so they did a lot of these things together. But nonetheless, in many ways, my faith and my siblings' faith is a fruit of their labor. Right? And I point this out to show that we don't need to be Paul, we don't need to be a church planter to labor fruitfully. Paul says, If I live on in the flesh, this will mean fruit from my labor. So raise your hand if you're alive. Okay, good. Most everyone. So, congratulations. Thank you, Benny. There is labor that you can be fruitful in. Ephesians actually says that Jesus bought this labor for you on the cross beforehand. So before you were born, this labor had been set apart for you. There are a lot of different fruitful labors that we could be invested in. For example, there could be, labors of devotion to God. So 2 Timothy says to cleanse yourself from what is dishonorable. We also just came off of a sermon series on the Kings and Chronicles. And we saw King Josiah labored very hard to rid the land of idols. So if you look in your personal life, inspecting to see if there's idols or there's unholy things, that is the labor that will produce fruit. And it's not easy. That's why it is a labor. You have to go in with the sledgehammer and destroy those idols. The church in Ephesus gathered their idols together and burned them. So cleansing yourself from what is dishonorable is a fruitful labor. Romans 12 says, be constant in prayer. Prayer is a labor. Ephesians 6 talks about prayer as in the context of a battlefield. Like he's saying, you have the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God. Use it with prayer. So in your personal life, prayer is also a wartime action, not simply a thing to make requests. And so you're fighting against the forces of evil that are around you. And that is a labor that bears fruit. There are also, labor. You can labor for your family. I already talked about my parents, how they labored to raise me and my siblings in the ways of the Lord. And if you're a parent, that is a very valuable and fruitful labor to raise your children in the ways of the Lord. You labor to love your spouse. And, we see that marriage is a depiction of Christ in the church. So, of course, that's a fruitful labor to make sure your marriage most closely represents Christ in the church, right? Or maybe you're young, and you have a family, but maybe you're young and you don't have a family yet. You can labor for your future family. So, right now, you have more time than you will ever have in your life. Like you might think, no, I have to hang out with my friends tonight, and I have this football game tomorrow night, and I have work 3 days a week. I'm so busy. But reality is once you get married and once you have kids, you're going to be all the busier. If you don't agree with me, talk to someone who's married and has kids, and they can probably attest. So right now, you have this time that you can use to ready yourself. You can dive into the Word. The deeper you dig now, the taller you can be when you're teaching your kids or you're trying to lead your family. There are also labors for the church. Paul spent much of his time, even while he was in prison, interceding for the church. Adam talked about a prayer last week. He says, Paul prays that the Philippians' love would abound more and more in all knowledge and discernment. So we can labor in interceding for our church. In fact, in the church covenant, which something you've agreed to if you're a member, says that we strive to love one another as Christ loves us and to lift up this church in our prayers. So if you're a member, you accidentally committed to praying for the church. So you better start. We're going to be doing a report to see if you've prayed for the church next week. But you can go through the letters and find the prayers that Paul prayed for the churches that he loved. You can pray those over this church. Um, Another thing is this church is we actually own this church. Well, this church owns this church. We own the property. So that means we have to take care of it. The grass has to be mowed and the trees trimmed and random things pressure washed. That is a labor that we can all contribute to as well. And if you don't know what needs to be done, talk to Brother Mike, talk to Brother Adam. I'm sure they have a list that you could get started on. Another thing that is part of caring for this property is our giving of our tithes and offerings, right? We like to shy away from this, but reality is that's actually also in the church covenant. And this church property takes money to upkeep, and it doesn't generate income. In case you didn't know, there's like no passive businesses going on in secret corners of the property, right? So another way you labor to take care of the church is by giving part of what you've earned through the past week. Romans 12 says to contribute to the needs of the saints. So another labor for the church would be to know your brothers and sisters well enough that you know when they have needs and you can step in and care for them. You don't need someone at the church to instruct you, but because of a personal relationship, because you love your brothers and sisters, you can take care of them. So those are 3 categories of labor. You have labor of devotion, chasing God, labor of your family, whether it's caring for your family now or preparing for a family in the future, and then laboring for the church. All of these labors bear fruit. You might also feel that maybe you've finished your task, like you've done your work. You look behind you and you see good work that's been done. But if you're still alive, that means God has more in store for you. He didn't forget to bring you home, right? Paul at this point has done a tremendous amount of work. He's planted more churches than I could ever conceive of, like absurd amounts of work. So he could easily start thinking like, I'm tired, my work is done, I'm just ready to die, and maybe become hopeless. But that's not what he says. He says that he's going to remain, that his remaining there is more necessary for the church. And it's important to the Philippians that he remains there. He's thinking, I can still bless the church. Specifically, in verse 25, he says that he's going to remain for their progress and joy of the faith. So you can be the person who remains for the progress and joy of other people's faith. Right? You've gone through things that maybe younger people have not even thought about. And you can be a reservoir of wisdom that's pointing them in the right direction. Or telling them, hey, don't do this. Right? Titus 2, for example, specifically teaches that the older women should teach the younger women. Right? So these older women are here for the progress of the younger women's faith. And we could say the same of older men. Like, older men should teach the younger men how to be fathers and husbands. So, if you're still alive, you still have a part to play. You're not done yet, and God didn't forget about you, right? So if Paul keeps living, he is confident that he will be able to magnify Christ, because to live is Christ. To live is to labor fruitfully. So he's saying, look, if I keep living, Christ is going to be magnified because I can labor fruitfully. Now we move on to the second part. And he says, to die is gain. So if I don't keep living, my head does end up on a silver platter. To die is gain. But we must be careful and agree too quickly with Paul that to die is gain if we don't understand what he means. Right? For example, someone who has lost hope and who is suicidal would agree with Paul, saying, yeah, dying is gain. But they're saying dying is gain is because they want to escape the pain of this world. And that's not Paul's motivation. Many religions have martyrs. Like, there are many Islamic martyrs. And they would also say, yes, death is gain. I will quickly die for the cause of my faith. But they are dying for their faith because they are promised a paradise of worldly things. But that's not Paul's motivation. Paul says death is gain for a very specific reason. He says death is gain in 23 because he has a desire to depart and be with Christ. That's why death is gain. Is it, you see, neither escape from prison, nor rest from his labor, nor removal of the pain are listed as primary reasons why death is gain. Is it wrong to want these things? To be in chronic pain and say, Lord, like how much longer will this pain persist in my body? No, that's not wrong. Is it wrong to think of, persecuted believers across the world and say, Lord, how long will you allow our brothers and sisters in northern Nigeria to be hacked to pieces with machetes? How long, Lord? No, it's not wrong. But if these become the primary reason that we believe death is gain, then we'll develop a mindset focused on escaping this earth. And when we're focused on escaping this earth, leaving this place behind, we will miss the fruitful labor that God has in front of us for right now. We'll die, and Jesus will say, like, I had this work that you could honor me in. Why were you so focused on running away? In addition, the primary reason death is gain is not that we get to go to a heaven with a mansion with many rooms and neighborhoods with golden streets, right? Like, heaven isn't a place where our wildest dreams come true or everything we wanted on this earth is made available. Heaven is a place that is shining God's glory. The primary reason why death is gain is because we get to be with Jesus. It's still about Jesus. You see, Paul's desire for death, which seems to be a pretty strong desire, right? He's like, man, I want to die so bad. It's driven by an adoration for Christ. Paul has been following Jesus for probably about 23 years now, and he's pored over the scriptures. He's seen the person of Jesus in the Word. He's met with Jesus in prayer. Says he's communed with Jesus by suffering for his name's sake. And despite all he has seen of Christ on this earth, he's left wanting more. He said, this is lovely, but it's not enough. And it's this that leads him to say later in the book, I count everything as a loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Jesus. Everything is loss because of how valuable it would be to know Jesus more. When he counts everything as loss, he counts his life as loss too. When we have that mentality that Jesus is so desirable that death is not something to fear, but a gain, a gateway to knowing him more, that mentality magnifies Christ. A mentality that's focused on escaping this earth or just running away from pain, that's not the mentality that magnifies Christ. The mentality that magnifies Christ is the one that says, Jesus is so lovely. Death is no longer something to fear. It's just a step to knowing him more. Right? So it was because living was Christ and dying was gain that Paul was not ashamed. Paul was not anxious that things would go south. He believed that he was in like a win-win scenario. If I live, Christ is going to be magnified. If I die, Christ is going to be magnified. So maybe you feel an apathy towards life. You don't know why you're still around. Or maybe you're drifting, looking for purpose in life. But believers, you are Christ's workmanship. Your life is His. He has prepared fruitful labor for you. So keep living and magnifying Him. If you've been living with an anxiety of how much life you have left or in a fear of death, remember that when we love Christ, death can be gain. We don't need to live in that fear anymore. That win-win scenario can be yours too. With that, we're going to pray. I guess the musicians should come up. Father, I thank you that